3 weeks after my 86th birthday, my son begged me not to open a certain envelope. By then, it was far too late. I still remember the sound of crystal glasses clinking together that evening. The private dining room at Hawthorne Grill glowed with soft amber light, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was exactly where I belonged. My children, grandchildren, and a few old family friends had gathered to celebrate my 86th birthday. At my age, you learn not to expect grand gestures. Just having family around the table felt like a gift. I wore a navy blue dress that had belonged in my closet for years. My late husband, Harold, always said it brought out the color of my eyes. As I looked around the room, I found myself imagining what he would have said if he had been there. He would have made everyone laugh. He would have told one of his terrible jokes and pretended not to notice us groaning. Most of all, he would have noticed the tension I was trying so hard to ignore. My son Daniel arrived 20 minutes late. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was the smell of whiskey that followed him into the room. His wife Vanessa walked in beside him, perfectly dressed as always, her smile polished enough to belong on a billboard. She kissed my cheek and wished me a happy birthday. Daniel barely looked at me before taking his seat. I told myself not to read too much into it. Families go through seasons. People get distracted. Life becomes complicated. That was what I had been telling myself for years. Dinner moved along pleasantly enough. The grandchildren talked about school. One of my nieces showed photos from a recent trip to Colorado. I smiled, listened, and tried to enjoy the evening. Yet every time I glanced toward Daniel, I caught him whispering something to Vanessa. Each time, she would shake her head slightly, as though warning him to stop. By dessert, I noticed he had refilled his glass more than once. The birthday cake arrived with 86 tiny candles sparkling across the frosting. Everyone sang. I laughed. For a few brief seconds, I felt genuinely happy. Then Daniel pushed back his chair. He stood up unsteadily and lifted his glass into the air. The room grew quiet. I assumed he was about to say something kind. Maybe share a memory about his father. Maybe tell a story from his childhood. Instead, he smirked and raised his glass toward me. Here's to the old lady who still won't let go of Dad's money. Silence crashed over the room. Complete silence. Even the waitstaff froze. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between Daniel and me. Vanessa looked horrified. One of my granddaughters stared down at her plate. My nephew cleared his throat awkwardly. Nobody seemed to know what to say. I simply folded my hands in my lap and smiled. Not because I wasn't hurt. Not because his words didn't land exactly where he intended them to. I smiled because at 86 years old, I had learned something important. The moment people reveal who they truly are is not the moment to interrupt them. It is the moment to listen. Daniel laughed nervously when nobody joined in. Then he sat down and reached for his drink. The conversation slowly resumed, but something had shifted. I felt it. The evening ended an hour later. Family members hugged me goodbye. A few apologized for Daniel's behavior without actually mentioning it. When I finally returned home, I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood alone in the quiet darkness of the house Harold and I had shared for 42 years. That was when I noticed the envelope waiting on the dining room table. And suddenly, my son's cruel birthday toast was no longer the most important thing that had happened that night. I stood in the doorway for several seconds, staring at the envelope as though it might disappear if I blinked. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock Harold had purchased during our 10th year of marriage. For more than 3 decades, that clock had marked birthdays, holidays, family dinners, and countless ordinary evenings. Tonight, it sounded different. Louder. Heavier. Almost as if it were counting down to something I could not yet see. The envelope sat alone in the center of the dining table. My name was written across the front in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Even after 6 years, I recognized every curve of every letter. My chest tightened. Harold had always had beautiful penmanship. He believed important things should be written by hand. Emails were for business. Text messages were for convenience. But family matters belonged on paper. Slowly, I pulled out a chair and sat down. The envelope was sealed, yellowed slightly with age. Not new, not recent. Whatever it contained had been waiting a long time. I ran my fingertips across the surface. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part wanted to leave it untouched forever, because as long as it remained sealed, it was only a possibility. Once opened, it would become reality. I glanced toward the framed photograph hanging above the fireplace. Harold smiled back at me from a fishing trip we had taken in Montana nearly 20 years earlier. He looked relaxed, sunburned, and happy. For a moment, I found myself talking to the picture the way I sometimes did when nobody was around. "What did you leave for me this time, Harold?" My voice sounded small in the empty room. Eventually, I slipped a finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside was a single folded letter. Nothing else. No legal documents. No account statements. Just a letter. I unfolded it carefully. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that finally convinced you to open the envelope." I stopped reading. A chill moved through me. Harold had always known me better than anyone. Even now, years after his passing, he seemed capable of predicting my thoughts. I continued. "I hope I am wrong. I hope our family is still together, still loving each other, still treating you with the respect you deserve. But if I am not wrong, then I need you to remember something. Love and entitlement are not the same thing." The words blurred slightly as my eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that arrive when an old wound is touched unexpectedly. Harold continued for several pages. He wrote about our life together, about raising Daniel, about the sacrifices we made during the difficult years when money was tight, about the importance of character. Then the tone changed. "If certain people begin seeing you as an obstacle instead of a mother, do not argue with them. Do not defend yourself. Do not beg them to understand. Simply pay attention. People reveal their priorities when they believe there will be consequences for honesty." I lowered the letter into my lap. Daniel's face flashed through my mind. The raised glass, the smirk, the laughter that had died the moment nobody joined him. Suddenly, I remembered something else. 3 months earlier, Daniel had asked a strange question during Sunday lunch. He had wanted to know whether I planned to simplify my finances. At the time, it seemed harmless. A son expressing concern for his aging mother. Now I wondered if that conversation had meant something entirely different. As the night deepened outside my windows, memory after memory began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. Questions about investments. Casual comments about retirement communities. Vanessa suggesting that managing a large house alone must be exhausting. None of it had seemed alarming on its own. Together, however, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. I looked back down at Harold's letter and read the final paragraph. "If the day ever comes when you feel alone, remember this. You are stronger than they think. And there are things I put in place long ago that they know nothing about." My pulse quickened. Things I put in place long ago. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Inside, the house remained perfectly still. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, I was no longer thinking about the humiliation of that evening. I was thinking about what Harold had known, and more importantly, what he had hidden. I did not sleep much that night. After reading Harold's letter 3 times, I carried it upstairs and placed it inside the top drawer of my bedside table. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because I had begun seeing familiar memories through a new lens. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows exactly as it had for years. I made coffee. I watered the small herb garden near the back porch. I fed the pair of cardinals that visited my bird feeder every morning. From the outside, nothing about my routine suggested that anything had changed. Inside, however, I was paying attention in a way I had not before. Harold's words stayed with me all day. People reveal their priorities when they believe there will be consequences for honesty. By noon, I found myself sitting at the dining room table with an old photo album open in front of me. At first, I thought I was simply reminiscing. Then I realized I was searching for something. Patterns. Moments. Small details I had dismissed over the years. There was Daniel at age 10, proudly holding a fishing pole beside his father. There he was graduating from college. There he was standing beside Vanessa on their wedding day. In every photograph, I could still see the boy I had raised. The problem was that the man sitting at my birthday dinner felt like a stranger. My phone rang shortly after 1 o'clock. "Vanessa." I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked how I was feeling after the celebration. Celebration. An interesting choice of words. I told her I was fine. She hesitated before bringing up Daniel's behavior. She said he had too much to drink. She said he had been stressed lately. She said he did not mean what he said. I listened quietly. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. Had I given any more thought to simplifying my financial affairs? There it was again. The same subject. Different day, different approach. I told her I had not made any decisions yet. She sounded disappointed, though she tried to hide it. After we hung up, I sat very still. 2 hours later, another memory surfaced. About 6 months earlier, Daniel had offered to help organize my paperwork. At the time, I had thought it was thoughtful. He spent nearly an entire afternoon asking questions about bank accounts, investment statements, insurance policies, and property records. I remembered feeling slightly uncomfortable, but I had brushed the feeling aside. Now, the memory felt different. By evening, I opened a storage cabinet in my study and pulled out several boxes of old records. Harold had handled most of our finances throughout our marriage, but he believed in keeping detailed files. Everything was labeled. Everything was organized. As I sorted through folders, I discovered a name that appeared repeatedly over the last decade. Rachel Green, the attorney Harold trusted more than anyone else. I vaguely remembered meeting her at a company retirement dinner years ago. Tucked inside one folder was a business card. On the back, written in Harold's handwriting, were 4 simple words. If necessary, call Rachel. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I looked toward the window where the evening sun cast long shadows across the lawn. For years, I had assumed Harold's letter was simply advice from a loving husband. Now I was beginning to suspect it was something else. A roadmap. And if that was true, then the answers I needed were no longer sitting in old memories. They were waiting with someone Harold had trusted enough to prepare for a future neither of us had wanted to imagine. The next morning, I called Rachel Green. I expected to leave a voicemail. Instead, she answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, professional, and surprisingly warm. When I introduced myself, there was a brief silence. Then she said something that immediately caught my attention. "Margaret, I have been wondering when you might call." I sat a little straighter in my chair. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. Rachel explained that she had worked closely with Harold for more than 15 years. She handled legal matters for his business after retirement and later assisted with estate planning. None of that surprised me. What surprised me was the certainty in her voice. It was almost as though my phone call had been expected. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at her office downtown. The building sat on a quiet corner overlooking the river. It was not flashy. No marble floors. No towering glass lobby. Just a well-kept brick building with polished brass lettering near the entrance. Harold would have approved. He never trusted people who spent more money on appearances than substance. Rachel greeted me personally when I arrived. She looked to be in her early 40s, composed and confident without being intimidating. Her office reflected the same personality. Organized shelves, framed photographs, no unnecessary decoration. After offering coffee, she closed the door and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I handed her Harold's letter. She read it carefully before placing it on the desk. "I was afraid this might be the letter he chose," she said quietly. Chose. The word lingered in my mind. Rachel opened a drawer and removed a thick file folder. My name was written across the tab. Seeing it sent an unexpected chill through me. She explained that several years before his passing, Harold had begun preparing contingency plans. At the time, she believed he was simply being thorough. But over the years, he became increasingly concerned about one specific issue: entitlement. Rachel did not rush her words. She spoke with the patience of someone delivering difficult information. Harold loved Daniel deeply. There was never any doubt about that. Yet he had noticed changes in him. Small things at first. Questions about future inheritances. Assumptions about money that did not belong to him. A growing belief that family assets were eventually his by default. As Rachel spoke, memories surfaced one after another. Comments I had ignored. Conversations I had excused. Warnings I had dismissed. None of them seemed alarming when viewed separately. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was impossible to overlook. Rachel then opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents, letters, and notes written by Harold over several years. One note stood out immediately. "If Daniel ever becomes more interested in my money than my wife, protect Margaret first." I stared at the sentence. The words felt heavy. Not because they were cruel, because they were accurate. Rachel allowed the silence to settle between us. Then she slid another document across the desk. "There is something else you need to know," she said. My pulse quickened. According to Rachel, about 8 months earlier, someone had contacted her office requesting information about certain family trusts. The request had been denied immediately because the Individual lacked authority. When I asked who had made the inquiry, Rachel held my gaze for several seconds. Then she answered, Daniel. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside the office window, people walked along the riverfront. Cars moved through intersections. Life continued as normal. Yet everything inside me shifted. 8 months earlier, long before the birthday dinner, long before the cruel toast, long before Harold's letter, Daniel had already been searching for answers about assets that were not his. Rachel folded her hands on the desk. Margaret, I think your husband understood something years ago that neither of us wanted to believe. I looked down at the file between us. For the first time, I was no longer wondering whether there was a problem. I was beginning to understand how long it had been growing. When I returned home from Rachel's office, I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. I simply sat in Harold's old armchair and watched the afternoon sunlight move slowly across the living room floor. At 86 years old, I had lived long enough to know that some truths arrive all at once, while others reveal themselves piece by piece. What Rachel had shown me was not a sudden betrayal. It was something far more unsettling. It was a pattern that had been forming for years while I convinced myself everything was normal. The following morning, I began looking through old records with fresh eyes. Bank statements, holiday cards, family emails, notes I had saved for sentimental reasons. None of them contained dramatic revelations. Instead, they contained dozens of small moments that suddenly looked very different. I found an email from Daniel written nearly 3 years earlier asking whether I had considered downsizing. At the time, I thought he was worried about me managing a large property alone. Reading it now, I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted toward the value of the house. Another message asked whether I had updated my estate documents recently. Another wanted details about investment accounts. Separately, they seemed harmless. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. A few days later, Rachel called. She had continued reviewing records that Harold had left behind. During our conversation, she mentioned something unexpected. Several years ago, Harold had quietly hired a financial investigator to review unusual activity involving family-related inquiries. My stomach tightened. According to the report, Daniel had not only contacted Rachel's office, he had also attempted to gather information from 2 financial advisors who had previously worked with Harold. None of them disclosed anything. Still, the effort itself revealed intent. After ending the call, I walked out onto my back porch. The maple tree Harold planted 25 years earlier swayed gently in the breeze. I remembered Daniel helping his father dig the hole when he was still a teenager. They had laughed the entire afternoon. For a moment, I felt an ache that had nothing to do with money, because underneath everything else was a painful question. When exactly had my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle? That evening, my phone rang. Daniel. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded unusually friendly. He asked how I was doing. He asked whether I needed help around the house. Then he casually mentioned that he and Vanessa would love to take me to dinner sometime soon. I listened carefully. The conversation felt rehearsed. Every sentence seemed designed to create warmth. Yet something was missing. Sincerity. Before we hung up, he asked whether I had spoken with any lawyers recently. The question arrived so suddenly that I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because it confirmed everything Rachel and Harold had feared. I told him no decisions had been made about anything. He sounded relieved. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I reached for a notebook and began writing down every conversation, every request, every unusual question I could remember from the past few years. If there was one thing Harold had always taught me, it was that facts matter more than feelings. By midnight, several pages were filled with dates, names, and details. Looking at them together, I saw something impossible to miss. Daniel and Vanessa were not reacting to recent events. They had been preparing for something for a very long time. The next morning, Rachel sent me a message asking if I was available for another meeting. She said she had uncovered information that might explain why Daniel seemed increasingly desperate. As I read her message, I felt the same sensation I had experienced the night I opened Harold's envelope. The feeling that somewhere just beyond my view, a much larger truth was waiting to be uncovered. The following afternoon, I met Rachel at her office again. This time, there was no small talk, no discussion about the weather, no polite conversation over coffee. The moment I sat down, I knew she had found something important. A thin folder rested on her desk. It was much smaller than the one she had shown me before, yet the expression on her face told me it carried far more weight. Rachel slid the folder toward me and folded her hands. Margaret, before I show you this, I need you to understand that none of what you are about to see is illegal. Not by itself, but it helps explain behavior. I nodded slowly. Over the previous week, I had stopped expecting good news. Rachel opened the folder. Inside were public financial records, property filings, and business documents connected to Daniel. Most of them meant very little to me at first glance. Then Rachel began explaining. Over the past several years, Daniel had invested in a series of business ventures. Some had performed reasonably well. Others had not. Several loans had been taken out. Additional credit had been extended. A property refinance appeared 2 years earlier. Another loan followed shortly after that. None of it was catastrophic. Yet together, the pattern was clear. Daniel was under financial pressure. Considerable financial pressure. I stared at the documents. My first reaction was not anger. It was sadness. Harold and I had spent decades teaching Daniel the value of patience, discipline, and living within his means. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had lost their influence. Rachel pointed to several entries. "This is where things become concerning," she said quietly. Certain financial obligations would come due within the next year. Significant amounts. The type of obligations that create urgency. The type that make people look for solutions. Or shortcuts. Suddenly, conversations from recent years began replaying inside my head. The questions about trusts. The comments about estate planning. The repeated interest in my finances. The pressure to simplify things. For the first time, I could see the timeline. None of this had started with my birthday dinner. That dinner had simply been the moment Daniel stopped hiding his frustration. Rachel then showed me something else. Notes from Harold. Detailed notes. Years before his death, Harold had apparently noticed subtle changes in Daniel's attitude whenever family finances were discussed. Not dramatic changes. Small ones. Assumptions. Expectations. Comments that suggested future inheritance had become part of Daniel's long-term planning. Harold had documented them carefully. Not because he wanted to punish his son, because he wanted to protect his wife. I felt my throat tighten as I read his words. Even now, Harold was still trying to take care of me. After the meeting ended, I drove home through familiar streets. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Neighbors trimmed hedges. The world looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet I felt different, clearer. For years, I had been treating each uncomfortable incident as an isolated event. A rude comment here. An awkward question there. A disappointing conversation somewhere in between. Now I could finally see the entire picture. And once seen, it could not be unseen. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from Vanessa. She wanted to know whether I would be available for dinner the following weekend. The invitation sounded unusually enthusiastic. Almost eager. A month earlier, I would have accepted without hesitation. Instead, I stared at the message for several minutes before replying. "That sounds lovely." The response came almost immediately. 3 smiling faces. Too quick. Too practiced. Too relieved. As I set my phone down, I remembered something Rachel had said before I left her office. If people believe they are getting closer to what they want, they often become less careful. Sitting alone in my quiet kitchen, I looked at Vanessa's cheerful message and understood exactly what Rachel meant. Because for the first time, I was no longer the one being observed. I was the one paying attention. The dinner took place the following Saturday. I arrived 5 minutes early, something Harold used to tease me about. Daniel and Vanessa had chosen a popular restaurant overlooking the lake. Families filled the outdoor patio. Boats drifted slowly across the water. It looked like the kind of evening people photographed for holiday cards. Vanessa greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. She hugged me tightly and complimented my outfit twice before we even reached the table. Daniel seemed equally determined to be charming. He pulled out my chair. He ordered my favorite iced tea before I asked. He even apologized again for his behavior at my birthday celebration. Months earlier, I might have been touched by the effort. Now I simply observed. The conversation flowed easily enough. They asked about my health. They asked about the house. They asked whether I had any travel plans. Everything felt pleasant on the surface. Yet beneath every question was the same invisible current. Information gathering. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa casually mentioned a retirement community located about 30 miles outside the city. She described walking trails, social activities, and maintenance-free living. Daniel immediately joined the conversation. He spoke about convenience, safety, simplicity. I nodded politely and took a sip of tea. Neither of them noticed that I never actually agreed with anything they were suggesting. They were too busy advancing the conversation they clearly hoped would lead somewhere else. Eventually, Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, have you thought any more about organizing your estate?" The question arrived so smoothly that it might have sounded natural to someone else. To me, it felt rehearsed. I smiled. "Actually, I have." Both of them became very still. It lasted only a second, but I noticed. Vanessa lowered her fork. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair. Their attention sharpened immediately. I continued carefully. "At my age, it is probably wise to make sure everything is properly arranged." The effect was immediate. The rest of dinner became almost comically pleasant. Every suggestion I made was praised. Every story I told was met with enthusiastic interest. Daniel laughed harder than necessary. Vanessa agreed with everything I said. For the first time, I understood exactly what Rachel meant. People become careless when they believe they are getting closer to what they want. After dinner, Daniel insisted on walking me to my car. As we stood beneath the parking lot lights, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "We just want what is best for you, Mom." I looked at him for several seconds. Somewhere beneath the worried expression, I could see genuine anxiety. Not concern, anxiety. The difference mattered. When I arrived home, my phone buzzed before I had even taken off my shoes. A message from Vanessa. It thanked me for a wonderful evening and mentioned how relieved she felt knowing I was finally thinking about the future. Relieved. The word lingered in my mind. I forwarded the message to Rachel. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Rachel listened quietly as I described the entire evening. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she asked a simple question. "Margaret, did either of them ask how you were feeling after your birthday?" I thought back carefully. The answer surprised me. No. They had asked about assets, property, planning, documents, future arrangements. But neither had asked about the humiliation of that evening or whether I had been hurt by Daniel's words. Rachel finally spoke again. "That tells us everything we need to know." After ending the call, I sat alone in the quiet house and reread Vanessa's message. Then I opened my notebook and added another entry to the growing list of observations. By the time I finished writing, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Daniel and Vanessa believed they were guiding me toward a decision. What they did not realize was that every step they took was revealing exactly who they were. 3 days later, I invited the family to my house for Sunday dinner. It was something I had done dozens of times over the years. Nothing about the invitation seemed unusual. In fact, I made sure it sounded ordinary. I mentioned that I had been thinking about the future. I mentioned that there were a few matters I wanted everyone to understand. By the time I finished the phone calls, I had no doubt the message would travel exactly where I intended. On Sunday afternoon, the house filled earlier than usual. Daniel and Vanessa arrived first. That alone told me something. Normally, they were late to nearly everything. This time, they were 20 minutes early. Vanessa carried a pie. Daniel carried a bottle of sparkling cider. Both wore bright smiles. As I welcomed them inside, I noticed the quick glance they exchanged when they thought I was not looking. It lasted less than a second. Anticipation, hope, relief. The same emotions I had begun seeing more frequently. Soon the rest of the family arrived. My niece Carol, my nephew Michael, several grandchildren. Laughter filled the living room. The smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a perfectly ordinary family gathering. Yet beneath the surface, something felt different. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. During dinner, Daniel remained unusually attentive. He refilled water glasses, asked if I needed anything, complimented the meal several times. Vanessa mirrored his behavior. She praised the house, the garden, the family photographs displayed throughout the dining room. It was almost impressive. Almost. After dessert, I stood and thanked everyone for coming. The room immediately quieted. Forks stopped moving. Conversations ended. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair. Vanessa folded her hands together. Neither realized how transparent they had become. I smiled and told everyone there were some important family matters I wanted to discuss. A visible spark appeared in Daniel's eyes. For a moment, he looked exactly like a child waiting to open a birthday present. Then the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house. Several family members exchanged puzzled looks. I already knew who it was. Rachel stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio. She greeted me warmly and nodded politely toward the others. The moment Daniel saw her, something changed. It was subtle. His smile weakened. Vanessa sat a little straighter. Neither looked comfortable anymore. Rachel took a seat beside me at the dining table. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, what is this about?" His voice sounded calm, but only barely. I looked around the table at faces I had known for decades. Some curious, some confused, some nervous. Then I answered honestly. "It is about making sure everyone understands the future." No one interrupted. Rachel opened her portfolio and arranged several documents neatly in front of her. Papers, letters, notes, evidence collected over years. Daniel's expression tightened. Vanessa stopped smiling altogether. Outside, the evening sun dipped lower behind the maple tree Harold planted long ago. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the documents resting on the table. For the first time since my 86th birthday, I felt completely at peace. Because the waiting was finally over. And whether Daniel realized it yet or not, the future he expected was about to disappear. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound in the room came from the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Rachel looked around the table before opening the first document. Her voice was calm and measured. She explained that Harold had spent years preparing for the possibility that family relationships might become complicated after his passing. She emphasized that his goal had never been to punish anyone. His goal had been to protect the people he loved and preserve the values he believed mattered most. Daniel shifted in his chair. Vanessa stared at the papers without blinking. Rachel continued. She reviewed the trust structure Harold had established years earlier. Most of the family listened politely, unsure where the conversation was leading. Then she reached the final section. The room seemed to grow quieter with every word. Harold had included a special provision. If evidence ever suggested that a beneficiary was attempting to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence Margaret regarding financial decisions, that beneficiary's inheritance would be significantly reduced. Several heads turned toward Daniel. His face lost color. Rachel calmly presented the records. The inquiries about trusts, the requests for confidential information, the repeated attempts to obtain financial details. None of it was dramatic. None of it was illegal. Yet together, the pattern was undeniable. Daniel opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again. For the first time in weeks, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Rachel then presented Harold's handwritten note. She read it aloud. The same words that had once brought tears to my eyes now filled the room with silence. If Daniel ever becomes more interested in my money than my wife, protect Margaret first. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the grandchildren seemed to understand the importance of the moment. Vanessa looked down at the table. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him. Rachel carefully closed the folder and explained the final outcome. The majority of the estate had already been placed into a family charitable foundation that Harold and I created together. The foundation would support educational scholarships, local community programs, and veteran assistance initiatives for decades to come. Family members would still receive modest gifts, but no one would receive the fortune some had apparently expected. Daniel looked stunned. Not angry. Not yet. Just stunned. He turned toward me. "Mom, you cannot be serious." His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I looked at my son and saw something I had been avoiding for years. Not a villain. Not a monster. Simply a man who had spent too long believing that someone else's money would solve his problems. "I am serious," I replied quietly. "And so was your father." The room remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. I felt calm. Not triumphant. Not vindictive. Calm. For weeks I had carried disappointment, sadness, and confusion. Now those feelings seemed lighter. The truth was finally sitting in the open where everyone could see it. No more guessing. No more pretending. No more carefully chosen words hiding uncomfortable realities. I stood and lifted my glass of iced tea. Several family members looked up. Daniel did not. His eyes remained fixed on the documents. "I would like to make one final toast," I said. Every face turned toward me. I smiled gently. "To family. The people who love you before they know what you own. The people who stay when there is nothing to gain. The people who understand that respect is worth more than any inheritance. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. Some lessons arrive through conversation. Others arrive through consequences. As the evening sun disappeared beyond the maple tree Harold planted all those years ago, I felt his presence more strongly than I had in a very long time. And for the first time since my 86th birthday, I knew the future was exactly where it belonged.